Yes, Mayor, it got posted. It was posted.
I don't see to change the agenda. This is just really one item. Why don't we move on to item 3, town council recommendation to waive first reading.
Thank you, Mayor. Oh, excuse me.
I'm sorry, Mayor, you didn't have your microphone on.
Okay.
Maybe we should start again.
Okay. So call to order the special meeting for January 24. Call to order. Second item, posting of agenda, changes to agenda. Has the agenda been posted?
Yes, it has.
Third item is town council recommendation to waive first reading. So
Thank you, Mayor. David Woltering, our planning and building support staff member, will provide you with a brief presentation.
Good afternoon, Mayor and council members. This item was continued from your January 11th meeting, and I'll take you through a PowerPoint and give you an update. Some background on this matter. It's an ordinance to facilitate workforce housing at the Branson School. And this is coming out of our housing element, the town's housing element, that's in the process of pursuing certification by the state of California. So this ordinance was actually formally introduced by the town council at your meeting of December 14th. At that meeting, Branson school representatives indicated some concerns about some of the proposed amendments. And they specifically were talking about some of the standards not being objective, and they wanted assurance that parking could be provided for some of the housing units that were being proposed for the campus. As part of the housing element, we've identified the opportunity for about 10 housing units on the Branson campus for faculty and staff, lower income housing units. Staff came back to the town council at your January 11th meeting with some proposed amendments based on some meetings with representatives of Branson School. And at that meeting and prior to that meeting, we heard that they had still some concerns about the specifics of the language and offered to continue to work with staff, and that staff could then come back to the town council with further refined amendments and clarifications. You as town council decided to continue this item at your January 11th meeting, and we as staff, along with your town attorney, have continued to work with Branson representatives, and I believe that at this point we've provided clarifications and also further amendments being proposed this afternoon to the town council, which I believe Branson representatives are supportive of. So a little bit of background about these amendments. Why are we doing this? As I mentioned, as part of the town's housing element, the 6th cycle housing element, the town has an objective, an assigned objective, of facilitating the development of 111 new housing units over this next 8-year period from 2023 through 2031. Approximately 10 to 11 housing units have been identified for the Branson School campus. As you recall, I'm sure, and we've discussed this before, as part of your prior housing element, the 5th cycle, certain properties within Branson were identified for housing. That housing was not developed during that 5th cycle. The state of California requires, in a circumstance like that, that if you then identify those same sites, reuse sites for housing, you need to then allow housing units by right without discretionary review and with objective development standards, and that 20% of those units be made affordable to lower income households. In order to address this circumstance, there are several amendments to the town's zoning ordinance that are being proposed. And on the slide here, I'm citing sections 18.16.030A that really allows for that 20% affordable housing units. And then the next section that I list here is that we're proposing to add a section to the zoning ordinance, 18.16.040C, to address density. Overall, the Branson property, is a little over 16 acres. And the idea is to leave the underlying zoning in place of 1 dwelling unit per acre, but to focus on those areas that are capable of being developed with these housing units. And the idea is to achieve an additional 10 units. And so language is proposed under C to do that. Maintain the underlying zoning, but provide the opportunity at specific locations for increased density. And then finally, the idea is, per the state standard mandate, is that there needs to be objective design and development standards to guide these housing units. So based on our meetings, and we've had many, with the Branson representatives over time now, in terms of what we initially proposed and working with Branson representatives, there are a number of amendments that we are now proposing this afternoon. The first one is kind of looking at height. And initially the idea was, staff was trying to suggest an objective development standard and also wanting to make sure that new development, these housing units, would be complementary to other development in the surrounding area. And the idea was to look at, say, 250 linear feet around a particular project, and to use that as the standard for what the height could be of a new unit or units. Branson had some concerns about that, thinking that perhaps there could be a single-story unit within that radius, within that area. And if we're talking multifamily, why not at least be able to do what you could do in the R1 district, which would be up to 30 feet. So the modification here is to essentially allow that. So they would be allowed to develop their property with these 10 to 11 housing units, and the height would be what's allowed in the R1 district, the maximum, or if higher, within a 200-foot radius, 250-foot radius, to again make sure that there's a complementary development standard. The next one is setbacks. And again, we're looking at the R1 district. This is R1B6. This district is R1B6. And the setbacks are, the front setback is 25, the side setback is 15, the rear setback is 40. But we have existing conditions. We have certain areas that are proximate to other development. And so again, trying to address existing circumstances, but provide objective development standards. There's a modification here that basically the setback would be those found in the applicable R1 district, or not less than 90% of what may be existing. Given that there are nearby residences, the idea here with the next item on the slide here is to look at screening to make sure as new development occurs, the new units are developed on the Branson campus, there's an opportunity to screen those units. And again, looking for objective standards, we went to our current code, and in the current code in terms of height standards, height standard for a fence is typically 4 feet, and in the side or rear yard, 6 feet. So the idea is to provide the opportunity for screening, but to use an objective standard in terms of front yard area, side yard area. The next item has to do with parking, and we'll get into more parking later, but initially, the idea is that Branson wanted to make sure for these 10 to 11 housing units that there would be the ability to park cars. And as you'll see later on, we came to an understanding that 2 cars, essentially per unit, would be the standard. And the idea really would be that either those spaces would be within a fully enclosed garage as part of the dwelling unit, or open with permeable pavers and landscaping, one or the other, and not to have carports. In an earlier version, we were looking at articulation and again, offsets and so forth on the new structures being proposed. And staff had put in the idea that we would use as a threshold FAR. So for example, if the floor area ratio was 25%, then that would trigger requiring at least 2 of the requirements for articulation in terms of offsets, et cetera. Thinking about that further and thinking about implementing it, why not have all of the multifamily units being proposed by Branson have the 2 required offsets? And Branson agreed. So that's the nature of that. As far as the next bullet here, what about materials and colors? And again, trying to be clear for implementation. The idea is that there would be a requirement that new multifamily structures would incorporate specific materials as listed here, and the colors would be earth tones. And then getting to the parking spaces, again, kind of clarifying that. The idea really is that there would be the allowance for 2 parking spaces per unit. And as I mentioned earlier, either within a fully enclosed garage or in an open setting. If it's open, then there would be a need for permeable pavers and landscaping to, again, soften and provide some screening. In our discussions with the Branson representatives, there were other issues that came up that required some, we believe, clarification. So for example, we had mentioned a number of times in an earlier draft reference to a campus master plan, and there was some confusion with that. Was that the campus master plan that was in place, is in place from 1978 or in the 70s, or is that a future campus master plan? We intended it to be a future master plan that they're working on actually now. That was the intent. However, again, trying to work with the state's direction of an objective design and development standard, the thought was eliminate reference to a campus master plan from the zoning ordinance entirely to eliminate the confusion, one, but also given that we're not there yet in terms of understanding exactly what they have in mind, not use that, not refer to that. So that language has been deleted. There was also a question from representatives of Branson about, well, who can live in these units? Is it just faculty and staff? What about family members? And so we provided clarification, as is typical. Obviously, faculty and staff would be in those units, but as they would have family members, of course, others would be allowed to reside in those units as well. And then there was quite a bit of discussion about the existing conditional use permit for Branson. A lot of discussion about that, in fact. And as we, including the town attorney, looked at this matter and realized that in terms of the reuse sites, state law really would preempt discretionary review or approval of these units. And so you'll see attached to the staff report a letter of agreement between the town attorney and the Branson representative clarifying that for the reuse sites, they are exempt from the CUP requirements. So what is the objective of our meeting today? The objective really is to reintroduce this ordinance with the further amendments that I've mentioned, described here, I've summarized. They're in more detail in your staff report, in your packet. And so that's the objective here, is to reintroduce this ordinance with the further amendments that I've described and with the understanding of the clarifications that I provided. Staff is finding that the proposed amendments are consistent with the town's general plan. And as you know, in terms of environmental review, the housing element has a certified EIR, Environmental Impact Report, which was certified by the town on May 31st of 2023. And the California Environmental Quality Act allows you to rely on a previously certified EIR when a project would not result in new significant adverse impacts or substantially increase those impacts. We don't see either occurring, and an addendum has been prepared. So today, we're recommending that you go forward, waive first reading, read by title only, and introduce the draft ordinance that's before you today. It's our understanding that based on the amendments and the clarifications provided, including the letter agreement, that the Branson representatives are supportive of this recommendation. Thank you.
Does anybody have questions of staff?
Yeah, I have one. Do we face any time limits currently for getting this done?
We do face time limits, and the town attorney may want to refer to those. I'd be happy to add comments, but the town attorney may want to.
In order for our housing element to be certified, we have to take all of our zoning actions by the end of January. Our housing element hasn't been certified yet, and we're in the process of hopefully having certification shortly, but they will not provide certification until we move forward with the zoning amendments.
Well, I thought when we had that meet, I had a meeting, so you know, with, it is. I had a meeting with Ben and Mary earlier today about this. I thought Mary's statement was that it could be done in February, but if so, then at the time that we present our housing element to HCD, we would have to take action on any ordinances at that time. So I thought she was kind of saying, we have another month, it's just going to be a
No, we
pain.
don't. Yeah, I think what she said was in order to have our housing element certified, we have to have this done. We're not envisioning having our housing element certified by our next council meeting. That was the question. So if we wanted to take more time with that ordinance, we could. That being said, it's preferable to try to have our first reading done in January.
Does anybody have any other questions, staff? Okay, why don't we open it up to the public? Is there anybody who wants to be heard?
There are no raised hands online?
Okay, I had a few questions, comments, or that I wanted to. So is it closed to the public? Yes, is there nobody else that wants to be heard? And I'm assuming there's nobody here? Okay, then we'll close the public comment time. And I had a couple questions I wanted to ask about on the first off, well, there's three. Number one, the height is to be 30 feet, which is consistent with zoning, or 250 feet of the particular site, which I think is a little arbitrary as a standard because I'm sure some of you know we have some 3-story buildings near Branson that would be much taller than that. So I don't know why we wouldn't just say it's the 30-foot limit. It sounds like the intent was to provide context for the neighborhood.
Correct.
And then Branson said, well, wait, but what if we can't build a 2-story building? And then you guys ended up with this proposal, but 30 feet gives them 2 stories. And if we use 250 feet for those, I mean, there are some homes across from Branson that are 3 stories. So I think that would be a concern and doesn't make sense. The second one is the provision on the setbacks talks about that you have to meet the zoning requirements or 90% less of existing. That is, I think, I don't like that provision. Let's just give an example. On Hillgert, we have, whose house is it? Marta
Curtis
and
Osterloh.
Curtis and Marta's house. And they have a garage that's literally right on the setback. Like, I don't know if it's 1 inch or if it's right on the setback, but it looks to me by property lines to be right there. So let's assume they have a 0 setback for that garage. Well, does that mean that 90% of the 0 is still 0? So that means that Branson can build those Hillgert properties right up to the setback. I don't think we know enough to have an analysis of each of these different sites that would give us comfort on that. So I think we should just say it's the zoning requirement. I also think it's poorly worded, and I think it could be argued as a interpretation issue. And then the final one is this idea that we would have different, 2 different articulations. One of those is called, quote, setbacks. Now, I know what an upper story setback is. That means that, the second story sets back from the first story. So that's an articulation. But the phrase, and that's in there too. But this one is just a standalone. It says setbacks. And I don't think that's any planning term that means anything or architectural term that means anything. And if it's meant to mean something, then we should clarify it. But that, I think, is problematic. So those are my 3 suggested edits.
So I could make some comments about that, but I also have one suggested edit, so I'll share that, and then we can take them maybe one at a time. But mine has to do with the parking, and of course, we would intend for these units to have parking, and it makes sense to have up to 2 spaces per unit. But as far as the use permit and overall traffic and parking, there have been very strict parking requirements at Branson. And so my suggestion for the parking section is to make it clear that the 2 units for the units, the 2 parking spaces for the units are for the exclusive use of the occupants of those buildings. They're not meant to be student or faculty or staff parking during school hours, because it's not meant to increase the amount of parking at Branson. It's meant to provide parking for the occupants of the units. So my wording would be something like, that the units are for the use of residents only, and that non-resident faculty, staff, and students and vendors wouldn't be allowed to park in those units during school hours. And that would keep those additional parking places as they're intended for the residents.
Don't we have to allow them to have guests, though?
Of course, no, but I'm just saying,
But the way you're saying it is just occupants.
oh, well, no, but they can have guests. Of course they can have
To
guests.
park. I mean, they
Yes.
can use those, okay.
Of
So I
course.
think we'd want to modify that.
I mean, they certainly can have guests. So residents and guests, it's just that during school hours, faculty, other non-resident faculty, students, and staff are not guests.
I have a procedural question. If we start editing this and revising this, what does that do to our timing? Then,
If we can make the edits today, we can still introduce the ordinance today. If it takes more, thought and drafting, we'd probably have to continue it to the next meeting and give direction to staff on further edits.
Yeah, I talked to Mary about whether or not we could make the edits that I was proposing, which are, just to take out a couple of those phrases and then the word setbacks. And she thought that that could just be done at this meeting and then adopt it as such.
yeah, I'm just concerned about how Branson's going to respond to that and if they're going to unravel this whole thing again.
Well, I mean, Julie, the thing is, this has been a staff negotiation with Branson, and we don't abdicate our responsibility to do zoning to staff or to Branson. So I think we need to do this and get it right. And I don't, putting in a phrase, for example, that says that the setbacks are 90% of the existing, that's open to an argument as to what that even means. So I think that we need to, at a minimum, do our legislative duty, which is wordsmith, so this thing makes sense. And I know that we can come back. I mean, I've been told that we can come back and change objective standards. Will we? No. I mean, that's a harder lift. So if there's some modest edits that we can make at this time to make it a better ordinance for residents that are going to have to live next to these structures, I think now is the time.
I'm not suggesting we're abdicating our duties, but I just want to be mindful of what the timing is and how Branson's going to respond. And I don't think we want to drag this out a lot. And maybe Ben has some thoughts about or David, about how Branson will respond to modifying those two provisions.
Let me respond in a couple of areas. I think for one, in terms of the articulation, this is easy. The setbacks, the word setbacks could simply be removed. I think the other areas of articulation are more clear and more typical. And Mayor, I would agree with you that setbacks in that menu is probably not appropriate and probably should be struck. So I'll start there, and there would be no issue doing that. In terms of kind of switching over to parking maybe and thinking about that, the idea of parking under E, parking, it says 2 dedicated parking spaces per unit by right, and after that, there could be additional language for residents and their guests right there. So that could address that.
Okay.
The matter of setback, 90%, let's explore that a little bit so that we're all clear about that. If there's an existing structure, and I see the concern, an existing structure on the campus, the Branson School property, looking at whatever that existing setback might be, it would be, say, 90% of that, or the applicable R1B6. And like I mentioned earlier, front 25, side 15, rear 40. I don't think the intent was to look at properties in the vicinity, but if there's an existing structure on the Branson property and there's an established setback and they're proposing to replace it or modify it, I think that's more the intent and not the surrounding area. If that makes a difference, Mayor, and maybe it doesn't in terms of your thinking on this.
Well, no, it doesn't. If you're going to take down a property, a residence, and rebuild, I think that, I don't know what that would be, but to me, that's not what the code says. It says, or not be less than 90% of the existing setbacks of the nearest existing structure.
Yeah.
So in my mind,
Yeah.
I thought, okay, I can't envision every single property on that, but I can envision those 2 ones by the field on Hillgert. And I thought, what's the nearest residence? And it's Marta and Curtis's. And I know that they have one structure, which is their garage, that has a 0 setback. So then my thought was, okay, well, number one, I don't think we should create a new standard, and we haven't even gone around and looked at to understand what the standard is that we're creating. I think that's bad policy and bad practice, but I was trying to think, okay, well, so if there's an 0 setback for that existing next structure, then it's a 0 for Branson, because that's how I interpret it. And I don't
It
think
just says-
that what you just said, I don't see that, even now that you've told me that,
Yeah.
I don't think it's susceptible to that reading.
What if it says of the nearest existing structure on the Branson campus, which is less? So then
Well,
you're,
okay, but-
then you're starting with the Branson buildings, and they basically have the same setback. So I think that means, for example, the housing that's at the end of Hillgert, there is some setback there, and then it could be interpreted that the setback has to be that, or 90, it has to be 90% of that, or at a minimum?
But if it says the nearest existing structure, that means that Hillgert property, we start looking at which house.
No, but to qualify it, say, a structure on the Branson campus,
Okay.
and that gets
so-
rid of that.
No, it doesn't get rid of
Why
that,
not?
because the nearest structure to the Hillgert one is probably one up the hill, and I don't know what those setbacks are. So what
but-
I'm saying is, why are we introducing a standard that we don't even, as we sit here now, know what it is? Why don't we just strike that language? If it's the nearest structure on the Branson campus, then Hillgert can look at something up on Circle and say, that setback is 2 feet, so I get to do that. And I get to expand Hillgert, which currently has a smaller footprint, to have a 2-foot setback. And is that on all 4 sides?
Oh, so you're saying you're including like circle houses?
Well, it says the
yeah.
nearest existing structure. So what you're saying is, if it said on the Branson campus, then Hillgert gets to look to some house up on Circle and say, whatever house I want to look at and whatever substandard setback, I get to use for that. It's introducing for 10 properties.
Yeah, that's a good
The
question.
motivation was to look at an existing circumstance. And so if there's an existing circumstance, should we try to work with that? That was the context. But in terms of the R1, B6, I mentioned those before, in terms of what they are. And, again, it's front 25, side 15, rear 40. So an option could be to work with the R1 setback standards as an option. Those are clear, those are objective. They provide guidance for future development. So that would be an option to consider.
So would it be 90% of the existing R1? Is that something
Why
that
even the
they want?
90%? Just that one? What do you?
Well, I don't know what their intent is, and I
Uh-huh.
don't want to torpedo this whole thing if
Think-
they're
I'm sorry.
trying to, get a little more leeway.
I think the intent was to kind of look at an existing circumstance and try to work with that.
I understand it came from staff, raw staff, right? It was our staff's attempt to say, let's fit this into the context of the neighborhood. So you look at a nearby residence for height, 250 feet away, for this, a house next door, and you match it. But the problem is, so say you have a substandard setback, so then we're going to create 2 substandard setbacks because the neighbor has it? I mean, that's quite, and then at that point, okay, well, what happens if you have a 2-foot setback? Do we eliminate parking? I mean, it came from raw staff. I understand the idea of it. I don't think it's a good idea, and I think we should stick with the zoning.
So can these houses be built with our basic zoning? I mean, is there any problem building it with our current zoning? And then, of course, if there's something that's being torn down and built up again, I mean, that size and shape generally, stays.
Right. I don't see necessarily an issue with using the standard in the zoning code, the R1B6 standard. Again, as the mayor mentioned, in terms of knowing specifics, in terms of the specific property or portion of property being considered for development, that's yet to come. But this is an objective standard. It is R1B6. It is a starting point. I agree with the mayor. The idea was to try to look at, is there a circumstance where we want to try to provide some leeway as far as context and existing circumstance? But the mayor is accurate in terms of what does that do in terms of an existing non-conforming situation. We would be essentially repeating that in a sense. So you do have the R1B6 standards for front, rear, and side, which you could use.
And if the school said maybe there's a cluster of 3 units and they need a special, and it works better if there's a special setback or something, do we have the ability to say, I mean, basically to offer a variance or something and to change that, or is this pretty much it?
We're trying to provide objective standards and eliminate discretionary review.
Okay,
However, if they want it to come before us and say, we would like, notwithstanding these objective standards, we'd like an exception to be allowed to do that, we could say yes then. And the goal is not to prevent housing on the campus. I mean, we all want that.
Right.
But it's just because we won't have any review in the future, if they want to just stick with these standards, then, but you know, I mean, if I had, there are 10 properties on Branson that this is subject to. I don't even know that some of these homes that live next door to these homes, these 10 sites, even know we're having this discussion. So to create a situation where you really deviate from setbacks or height standards, it seems inappropriate. And I just think that it seems like I get the reason, it was context of the neighborhood, but I just think it's
so I think
probably-
it seems reasonable to stick with the standards we have, knowing that, not that we want exceptions, but there could be one, and Branson's able to build the 10 units with what, you know, with the current standards. I think that sounds fine.
So may I just clarify here? So Mayor, are you proposing that on page A3, under A, building mass, orientation, scale, and articulation, when it says minimum yard setbacks, minimum yard requirements, i.e. setbacks, am I looking at the right place here?
Yes,
Yeah,
you are.
that's right.
That's
For
correct.
new multifamily residents shall be those found in the R1 district of the town code, and then just to eliminate the
Period.
rest.
right.
To further clarify, if I could, I think we probably should say the R1B6 district, right? That's what it is.
Okay,
And then the paragraph above that, it should just be, I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses, but the tallest existing buildings in the, you know, of the height, yeah. Oh, brilliant. Yeah, the height of the new multifamily residence shall not exceed that of the height for structures in the R1 district
Or
as set
R1B6.
forth in section 18.16.060, period.
does that also need that R1B6 or whatever you said?
It's the R1 district, and I understand your objective, Mayor. And to be more precise, more clear, more objective. And certainly the R1 standard up to 30 feet does do that.
Okay, so why don't we make that edit
Okay,
of 30 feet? And then just strike the word setbacks.
right.
And then the parking one is just that phrase
Add
for
For residents and their guests.
Correct, and we would just insert that where I indicated earlier, E parking after by right. It would then say by right for residents and their guests, right?
Yes, I think that works.
Does that include like a service person coming over? Is that considered a guest,
Yes,
a handyman or handy person?
yes.
Okay.
Or you can use
Or
the term
unhandy.
invitees.
Excuse me, Mayor, can I clarify, so your topic of articulation, the poorly worded want to remove setback, do we know where that is exactly in here?
Yes, I do. We're going to, as I understand it, strike setback, only setback, correct?
Yeah, sex backs plural,
Right, that's correct.
yes.
Yes.
Where is that exactly?
Yeah, which page?
Yeah, that's it's also on A3. It's the last full paragraph. It says,
Which letter?
there's no letter.
Oh,
It's
page A3,
A3.
okay.
And it says, you know, you have to do 2 of the following, and it includes,
Setbacks would be
setbacks.
deleted there, so it would read pitched roofs, wall offsets, setbacks, plural, would be struck, upper story setbacks, balcony setbacks, and/or changes in wall and roof planes. The only change would be to strike setbacks, plural, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Got it.
And with that, does anybody else have any?
Do we know whether a representative of Branson is attending this meeting by Zoom?
I don't know, but we didn't hear from anyone when we opened it up for public comment.
There is a hand raised at this point.
So I'm not inclined to open it up for public comment, but are other people wanting to?
Well, let me ask another question. Once we pass whatever we pass today, can Branson do anything about it if they don't like something we've done?
I mean, they can't pass a new ordinance.
Well, that's my thinking, is they're stuck with it.
That's correct.
Through the mayor,
That-
if I could, this is first reading, so this is not adoption. It would come back, presumably, if you move forward today with first reading, it would come back for second reading and adoption on February 15th is the staff's recommendation to you today.
Okay. Is there a motion?
I have a question.
Yes.
Were we to make these changes without hearing from whoever has their hand raised on the Zoom, would Branson have another opportunity to go to HCD and try to negotiate this ordinance with the staff of HCD?
I mean, Branson already has gone to HCD.
I know, that's why I'm
But that
asking.
doesn't mean that they get to negotiate our ordinance, which HCD, because that's not HCD's role.
Branson, any member of the public has an opportunity to continue their discussions with HCD and maintain their objections to our housing element and all the implementing zoning ordinances.
So I would be inclined to hear the public comment on the changes that we've just made.
Is there another person that wants to do that? Because as I said, I think we should move on to a decision.
I'm torn.
I mean, so
I
let's
guess
just play it out. So Branson says, I don't like it. So what are you going to do? You're going to change? I'm not going to, because I don't think that's appropriate.
But we could at least hear, maybe they like it. Maybe they say this is immaterial.
Then
I don't know.
That doesn't seem like a worthy reason to reopen public comment either.
Well, we don't know. We don't know what they're going to say. We're totally
Well, But that's the fault of whoever has got that hand up. They didn't get it up at the appropriate time.
But they didn't know the changes we were proposing. They had no ability to make a comment because they didn't know what changes we were going to make.
Well, just so you understand, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this meeting is I wanted to understand how this came about. And what I was told is that the idea of the size of the height was because they were concerned that it would be limited to 1 story. And so they felt good when it was moved to be 30 feet, but then this other provision continued to be in there. And as I said, I think it potentially goes beyond what the height is. The second one is a setback provision that, as I said, I don't think that interpretation that David said is susceptible under the language. So maybe it meant one thing to David, maybe it meant one thing to Branson. I don't know, because I think you could see a lawsuit over that provision, but I can't imagine changing that. We're going to go back to that language, which doesn't even mean. And then the third one the parking one, I just can't believe that's of issue.
Because that was, the whole point of that was to make sure that there was a right to have parking. And so, yes, indeed, we totally agree there should be a right to have parking, and 2 spaces per unit makes perfect sense. And the intention wasn't to increase Branson parking, but to have parking for guests and residents. So I don't think that should change anything.
once HCD approves our plan, if they do, what rights would Branson or any other citizen have to comment on it at that point? Or to,
As I understand it, they wouldn't.
well, that's my,
I mean, we don't normally have private individuals, whether it be an institution or otherwise, saying, here's your ordinance now change it. I mean,
But I thought we did understand that if if in the future there are building plans that need some variance from this, that could be allowed by the council. Is that correct?
that's.
Not that
as
we
I
want to do
understand
that, but that's where there is some room in the future if needed.
it. Right.
Through the mayor, if I could, just as a reminder, in terms of HCD comments to the town, the idea which precipitated a lot of this discussion was to make sure you have objective design and development standards. So that's the focus. The idea really is for the town, obviously to work with its community members, but for the town to propose objective design and development standards. That's up to the town to decide. Are they
What those-
objective? And that's the focus, should be the focus. Are they objective?
Right. So with that, I'll make a motion to approve.
second.
Clarify, it's a motion to reintroduce.
That's
not to approve.
correct. With the edits.
With the edits, yes, thank you.
Councilmember McMillan? Councilmember Robbins?
Aye.
Mayor Breckus?
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Kircher?
Aye.
Councilmember Cool?
Aye.
All right, with a vote of 5, passes unanimously.
And we're adjourned. Oh, wait, do I have public comment for items not on the agenda? I don't. I'm sorry, we're adjourned.
Thank you, Mayor and Council.